This is the Stop Time Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Hopkins, and I'm here to engage you in thought-provoking, motivational conversations around practicing the art of living in the moment. I'm a certified life coach, and I'm excited to dig deep and offer insights into embracing who we are and where we are at. So my next guest is the number one New York Times bestselling author of 27 novels. Her books have been translated into 34 languages in 35 countries. 4 of her novels have been made into television movies, including My Sister's Keeper, starring Cameron Diaz. Her novel, Small Great Things, has been optioned for motion picture adaptation and is set to star Viola Davis and Julia Roberts. Her 2 young adult novels, Between the Lines and Off the Page, co-written with her daughter, Samantha Van Leer, have been adapted and developed by the authors into a musical called Between the Lines, which is expected to premiere off-Broadway later this year. We're going to talk a little bit about that and some other fun stuff. I'm so excited, Jodi, to have you here on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it's nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
If it's okay, I'd like to jump in just for a second with something that you wrote. Actually, I came across it in the preface of the Breathe libretto.
Great.
And for those listening who don't know, Breathe is a musical that was conceived and written by Jodi and playwright Timothy Allen MacDonald during isolation as the world around us was changing before our eyes. Jodi, you wrote, "We wanted to memorialize how we were all experiencing the same fear and frustration, and we wanted to do it on stage. After all, what's theater but a person isolated in their own seat, having the same feelings as the person beside them because of the performance they're watching?" You capture that brilliantly.
You know, it's funny, as an artist, as a writer, almost as soon as the pandemic started, I was thinking, how are we going to memorialize this? How are we writers going to put this down on paper so that we categorize everything we've learned, we catalog it, and we don't forget, you know? And certainly theater has been the medium for a lot of massive world events that were devastating and that have shook us. You know, you look at something like Come From Away, or you look at Rent, all of those things, The Normal Heart, were all written, really to memorialize a tragedy, a great tragedy. And we were thinking, Tim MacDonald and I were thinking about this when we came home in March. One of the last things that I did in the real world before it all shut down was go to the wedding of Ariel Jacobs. Ariel is a lovely Broadway performer who is attached to Between the Lines. And we all trooped down to Mexico for her wedding. So I went with Tim and his husband and our director, Jeff Calhoun, and his husband. And we were all seated at a table together. We had a lovely time. All of them came home with COVID.
Oh my God.
I am the only person who did not catch it, which is actually really good because I have asthma and I don't think it would have gone well for me. But, you know, we all kind of came back, and after Tim recovered, we started talking about this, about how we could make sense of what was going on. And almost immediately we sat down and we decided 2 things. We wanted to employ as many people in the industry as humanly possible because nobody was making money. Mm-hmm. And we really wanted to tell a variety of stories. We kept seeing it like a suite of stories. And we sat down to write what started as 4 vignettes. And we looked at 4 different people who when the pandemic hit, were affected different ways, their relationships, their health, their communities. And we wanted to really run the gamut based on what we were seeing and experiencing with our friends and other people, you know, that we knew. And so we began to write short stories, little short stories, where we sort of set up each of the vignettes that we were then going to turn into a musical vignette. As I said, we started with 4 of these, and somewhere in the middle of doing all this, George Floyd was murdered. And we really believed that the protests that erupted were very much tied into what was happening in the world in the pandemic. I think we were forced to have a racial reckoning that we have pushed aside way too often, because when you're sitting there and the world is shut down, you can't help but look in that mirror and see things that maybe you didn't want to acknowledge. So we really wanted to add a vignette that included something about the Black Lives Matter movement. And we also knew we were not the right writers for that. And so we turned to Douglas Lyons, who I think said yes within 10 seconds of being pitched this. And he and Ethan Pachar wrote this vignette that became the 5th vignette in Breathe. And so we had gone out to 4 different songwriting teams prior to that, plus Ethan and Douglas. So we had 5 teams working on 5 different vignettes. Tim and I were writing the librettos for the 4 of them. And working with all of these collaborators was amazing and totally different because everyone needed us in a different way. And the vignettes ranged from the sublime and the silly to the rom-com to great tragedy, the greatest loss of all, which would be the loss of a life. And as every time that we had a meeting and this became more physically realized, we decided we didn't just want 5 songwriting teams. We also wanted to have 5 directors, and we wanted Jeff Calhoun to be a supervising director for us, in addition to doing one of the pieces. Then we started to think, how do you make this happen during a pandemic? And that is quite a challenge. When we workshopped it, which we realized we had to do, we actually had 3 rooms running at once at the 92nd Street Y. We COVID tested everyone who came into it. We asked for 2 actors in most cases when we could, 2 actors who would quarantine together. And each room had its own stage manager, its own music director, its own director, the 2 actors, and all the creatives zoomed in.
Wow.
And yeah, so it was like we were constantly trying to think outside the box to make it happen. Mm-hmm. And even when we actually filmed it for streaming, we filmed it at the 92nd Street Y, the cast never met each other. In between each vignette, the entire theater had to be cleaned. Wow. And I was never there. I still had my asthma. I had no vaccine. I was stuck here in New Hampshire. So I watched the filming of that musical from a very weird sideways angle in a camera.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was wild. It was really, really wild to do. But, it's funny. I feel like during this pandemic, when it came to the theater industry, people fell into 2 camps, and you could very quickly tell who was in which camp. The ones that were holding their hands over their head going, the sky is falling, and burying themselves in the sand, or the ones who said, all right, now let's get to work. How do we do this? Mm-hmm. And I'm really proud of Breathe. I'm delighted by how beautifully it came out and how moving it was for so many people who saw it and wrote us to say that it was healing and really helped them make sense of 2020, including people who had lost family members during the pandemic, which was great. I'm even more proud that the Library of Congress reached out to us and asked to have Breathe be part of their archives, which they are creating about artwork that was made during the pandemic. And I was like, oh, wow, that makes me feel like we actually accomplished exactly what we set out to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm so curious about 2 things. One is you talked about those 2 camps, which I totally get. And from my perspective as a coach, we talk about lenses, right? We talk about, they all serve us at different times, right? So there's the victim lens, things are happening to us, and we shift up the ladder depending on the circumstance. And so I am super curious to ask you, talk to me about that space between when stuff was when you were a victim, because we were all victims. And when you put it into motion, talk to me about that space.
Lisa, that was terrible. I mean, in this community, how hard it is to cross the finish line. Mm-hmm. Between the Lines is a project that we have been working on for 7 years. Tim is our official book writer, but has been lovely about that was how I learned how to write a libretto, actually, by working on Between the Lines with him. And we, my daughter, who wrote the original novel, the source material with me, we have both been instrumental in helping craft that libretto. We found the songwriters. We built that show from the ground up with the incredible assistance of Daryl Roth, who is amazing and who's believed in this project from day one. But we did our out of town in Kansas City. We paid our dues. And so we had really fought hard to get where we were, and we finally had a spot at second stage. And we were like, here we go. I had a room. I was all ready to move to New York for 6 weeks, during the rehearsal process. We were so excited. I literally had boxes packed with the stuff that I was taking to New York. And when the pandemic hit, I immediately reached out and I said to the Airbnb host, I'm going to postpone this for a week. We thought we were, 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks at the beginning. And I obviously was not going to start rehearsals in New York as I thought I was going to a week later. And that 2 weeks grew and ballooned and everything shut down. And eventually one day I had to call the Airbnb host and say, I'm not coming. And I have a charmed life. I have a husband I love to death. I have 3 amazing, healthy children who are making the world a better place. I live in a beautiful area. I love my dogs. I mean, I've got it all, right? I've had success in my career. I can't tell you how hard I cried that day, because that was a colossal loss. To be that close to a finish line and to have something that no one had on their bingo card make you lose it was so hard for me to wrap my head around. I am the kind of person who gets stuff done. I do. I don't procrastinate. I make things happen when I want them to happen. I engineer things and I work hard. And this was something I couldn't fix. And that was really hard for me. And it felt like grieving. It took me many, many months to get over that. And, even though we were in hiatus, we were just, the plane was circling for us. We weren't dead yet. We also knew that Second Stage already had a season for 2021 and we weren't going to be part of it. And, we do actually have a future for Between the Lines. I can say that now. I can't officially tell you what it is because it hasn't been announced yet, but it's all good news. And yet that was really, really hard. And that wasn't the only thing that I lost too, because in addition to Between the Lines, Tim and I have adapted The Book Thief as a musical. And that was supposed to open in right outside of Manchester in the United Kingdom this year. Obviously that did not happen and it was all pushed another year. So, now I have things happening in 2022 allegedly, but to be totally honest, I'm very curious about how I'm going to mount a musical in the UK when I can't technically get there yet. We had a workshop a few weeks ago with my creative team in one space for the first time in 2 years. And our director was supposed to come from England. She couldn't come.
No.
We had 10-hour Zoom days with her.
It's so interesting. And it makes sense. Thank you for sharing that because I mean, those are specifics, but that's your life. So, no apologies necessary. I mean, those were huge things. And I love how you sort of, it's analogous to the idea of not being able to make the finish line, especially someone like yourself who always takes charge, always takes the reins, is aware of privilege, is aware of all of these things. And that must have been really tricky for you. What did you learn about yourself during that time?
I learned that it's okay to have a loss. You can't compare your loss to someone else's. I can tell you that during this pandemic, everybody lost something, right? Now, in some cases, it was a job. In some cases, it was a person. In my case, it was something that I had been looking forward to for almost a decade. For other people, it could have been a wedding. It could have been a job. It could have been a vacation. I mean, everyone lost something. And whether you were 3 years old or 18 years old or 30 or 70, we were all sacrificing something. Just because you didn't sacrifice the same thing as someone else did not mean you didn't feel it. So I think the first thing I learned was to give myself permission to grieve something. And also to recognize, talk about oversharing, but I travel a lot. I'm on book tour a lot of the year. I do research on site when I'm researching a book. I'm in New York at least once a month, or I used to be in New York at least once a month for either publishing stuff or for stuff with a musical. And when this hit, and I literally stayed in my house for 15 months because of my asthma. I didn't go shopping. I didn't go into a store for over 15 months. And my husband was so excited. He was like, isn't this great? Isn't it great that we get to spend all this time together? And yes, it was great. I love him and I love being with him, but I was also very aware of what I wasn't doing. Yep. And so I think, I learned that I can give myself permission to be sad. And I also learned that when you're angry at the world, I think you have a choice. You have a choice to either remain angry at the world and, I don't know, lash out on Twitter or do something that is ultimately not constructive. It might help you feel better in that moment, but you can also take that anger and say, what am I going to do with this?
Yeah.
Because if you can't control one area of your life, you may be able to control another area.
Interesting. And it's, not surprising you use the word control. I mean,
just a tad.
No, I love it though. Because you're very cognizant. I can feel that you're very cognizant of your superpower. And it's also your Achilles heel in a way, isn't it?
100%.
Yeah.
It really is. I never expected to live through something that I really had so little control over. Yeah. So little. That really still shakes me now.
But do you know what the coolest thing is? It really strikes me that since you are the what if queen, right? I mean, right? And so you are the one that always asks, what if? And that's like your zone, right? That's where you live with possibilities of stories and that's where your flow is. And so you were given a front row seat to a what if that you were out of control of. Because,
100%.
right?
100%. Yeah. And certainly writing Breathe was my way of manifesting control in some way, of wrapping my head around it. And interestingly, the reason I called Tim and I was like, we need to do this in theater for the reason that you cited when you read, that the part of what I wrote in the libretto. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was also because I didn't know how to do it in a novel yet. Mm-hmm. I couldn't wrap my head around that. And, I love these two different types of writing that I do. I love it because they're so different. And when I'm working a lot with Tim on a show, and then I come back to my office to write a novel, I'm always like, where is he? Why am I here alone? And the collaboration in theater is what I am absolutely addicted to, because when you're a novelist, it's very solitary. So, I think that for me, writing Breathe helped me figure out how I was going to tell that story in a novel. And eventually when we finished Breathe, that's what I did. I sat down and I wrote a book that I didn't think I was going to write, that I wasn't contracted to write, that just, I felt like I had to write it. Mm-hmm. And I've always said, in many ways, novels are therapy for the author. And that is Wish You Were Here. And that's coming out in November, and it's really, again, it's my way of how to take a novel and wrap the pandemic inside it in a way that hopefully leaves you as a reader feeling a little healing. And I think understanding a little bit more about yourself and what you've learned and what is important. That was what I think really mattered to me. The things that I thought were important turned out to not always be important. Mm-hmm. And the things that I didn't ascribe value to turned out to be very important.
Yeah. Perspective, right? It's so interesting because with Breathe, in a way, you talk about the difference in your, your readiness and your approach. Yeah. Is that you were a character in Breathe. I mean, you were living it. You were, you weren't creating it. Protagonist. Yeah, exactly. Whereas it makes sense that with this new piece, which the wish you were here, which sounds fantastic, by the way. It sounds like that gave you enough time. I don't know what the timeline of writing was, but to sort of experience it like you did. I know in your research that you go to prisons, you go everywhere to research. So you had sort of lived in that isolation. Yeah. Did this experience as an artist, lived the Breathe experience. And then Jodi, the writer who does the what ifs, was able to take that into a fictional thing with your new novel, right?
Yeah. And for Breathe, it was one of the things I loved the most about Breathe was that people would come to it from all walks of life. And they would be like, oh my God, that was my life. That was what it was like in my house at that moment. And people could relate to, if you couldn't relate to all 5 vignettes, you could relate to one of them. Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that people could find themselves in it and also find the things that we found when we were writing it starting in like April. And there were things we already had forgotten from March. Like, do you remember when we were washing our broccoli? And we weren't wearing masks yet. And all the stuff that we have sort of already let fall by the wayside, we wanted to memorialize all that. So I do think that part of that, yes, was living through writing Breathe and really creating those 5 different vignettes and 5 different scenarios. But also, when I turned to the novel and I started to think about the pandemic, I did have to do research, and I wound up doing it all online.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing Zoom interviews and taping them and transcribing them. And I was talking to medical professionals who were on the front lines. And I was talking to people who had survived COVID and after being hospitalized for a very long time. And I was actually shocked by that, because I decided I was going to go on social media and say, okay, did you have these symptoms? Were you hospitalized? I would say within 10 minutes, I had 200 responses. Wow. 10 minutes. And these were people who wanted to tell their story, because they said, we want people to know this is real, and we want them to know what we experienced.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. No, it's so important. Are there any what ifs in your life that you'd be willing to pursue, in the story of your life?
Like I said, I've had a pretty charmed existence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the what if for me would be, what if I hadn't stopped teaching a million years ago and didn't write for a living, and it was really a nexus of affairs that led to that. I was married at the time. I was pregnant with my first son. I was working at a school district in Concord, Massachusetts as a new English teacher. And they pink slipped all 6 new teachers the first day of classes, because they didn't have enough money in the budget next year. So we all knew we were going to be fired at the end of the year. And I got pregnant. And I was like, well, I guess I'm going to leave and, raise this kid. And when I left, I was writing, when my son was an infant and he was asleep, and then my husband would come home from work and he would watch the baby and I would go write. And then I got pregnant again, and I kind of just kept doing that. And it was in part because my husband could support us. I didn't have to go back to teaching right away, because it would have been a watch with daycare anyway. That I was able to do that. I had that support. But there is a world in which I went back to teaching and just became a really good English teacher. And I do think about that. I mean, that was sort of a weird confluence of events that led me to be at home at a certain time, working on a different piece of my brain and a different craft. Yeah. So I that's probably the biggest what if for me.
It's so cool. It stands out to me that, and again, no judgment whatsoever. It's just, again, as a coach, I just listen, but it stands out to me that you went to the past, not future. It's funny, like.
That's funny. Yeah. I didn't think about it. Yeah.
Right.
It's true. But I like to think that I'd like to hope that my future is still, fungible enough that I can make the things happen that I want to. I think that's the difference.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, again, it sort of speaks to your appreciation for the choices that you made, for the people that supported you. You mentioned your husband and all of that. I mean, and looking back and seeing the gift and everything as you've done with the pandemic.
And I think the thing for me is, like, I became so addicted to working on musicals because, as I said, of the collaboration and the fact that Tim and I have a great partnership as writers. And I love working with him, and I love working with songwriters, and I love that it's different every time. And I love the Jenga of putting together a show. Mm-hmm. I love that when you pull one of the pieces out, everything else starts to crumble around you until you figure out a way to shore it back up again. I love being given a Lego set of a show and being told, take the entire thing apart and now make something else that people recognize, because that's pretty much what a rewrite is. And for me, that kind of creativity is something that is so fun to me to tap into at this point in my life. I mean, I'm 55 years old. I could coast a little, but I really like this. I really like this. And it's like, this is my goal now. Okay. I got the publishing thing. I got it. I feel confident in my publishing and my novels. I want to make sure that I'm writing something that people get to see in the theater. That's what I want to do next.
That's awesome.
I'm not done. I'm just not done yet.
Hey, how do you want to be remembered?
So, this is a running joke in my family, because with my daughter, who is a writer, and at one point I had said that when I wanted to be remembered the way Charlotte from Charlotte's Web is remembered. And she goes, good friend, better pig. And I was like, that is not the quote. As long as she was a good writer and an even better friend, but okay. So I think that I will be remembered as a writer, which I think is great because it's something I've worked very hard at my whole life. I hope I hope that I'm remembered as someone who made people open their minds a little bit. That would be a great legacy, because that's what I try to do when I approach a project.
Why is that important to you?
Because that is how I think we change the world, one mind at a time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What do you know will be true about you no matter what happens?
That's a good question. I think that I will always try to do the best I can at any given moment. And I think that's an important lesson to learn, because there are some moments you may not be at your very best, but you're still giving it your all.
Mm-hmm.
I want to challenge myself in a way that keeps me fresh and keeps my material fresh. So I will constantly try to find a way to continue to learn, challenge, grow at my craft so that it becomes fresh and interesting to a reader.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, that comes across in each, consecutive thing that you create 100%. I have a what if for you.
Oh, great.
Well, I know. But seriously, what if you couldn't write? What if suddenly writing wasn't a thing? What if, I don't know, there's two ways of thinking it. One would be that you knew it and it was taken away from you. And the other is just, it doesn't exist. But whichever one sort of floats your boat, what if?
I mean, well, writing is always going to be a thing. The thing that it might not be is a publishing thing. And that, I think, is a very interesting question. Would you still write if nobody ever read it? And the answer is yes. Writers write because they have to. It's a lot more gratifying when people read it. But, if you're not published, you still get to call yourself a writer because you're doing the work. So I think I would still write. You think about Salinger, who lived not that far from me, who they found all his manuscripts in his garage,
wow.
That were never published, but he was still writing.
Yeah.
So I would keep writing. I have actually thought about this. Like, if I was in prison and I didn't have access to a pencil, I don't know why my brain went here. Be like, I would keep telling myself a story over and over and adding to it so that I constantly had, I had a thread of a story going somehow. Like I would just make myself remember it. And I think you can be a storyteller even if you never type or write or set anything to paper. So I think I would still be doing that. I mean, there's also a complete world where, I am doing nothing except baking amazing bread, or becoming a pastry chef. Yeah. Or just traveling to the places that I still want to go that I haven't been either. Because I love doing that.
It's so true. And I mean, storytelling obviously was an oral tradition for forever.
Yeah. That's the thing about creativity. It finds a new outlet. It's a little bit like a river, with a tributary. If you dam up a river, it's going to bleed out somewhere else.
100%. What is your definition of living in the moment?
I think it is being attuned to the world around you, but also being cognizant of the platform you have, the podium you have, and what you say when you're standing at it. I am fortunate. I'm not at the beginning of my career anymore. I'm like very, very entrenched. And I am very lucky to have people who seem to care what I say. And because of that, I think really hard about what stories I choose to tell and why I choose to tell them. And it's not even a novel. It can be a newsletter I send out. Yeah. I'm not just going to send a newsletter for the sake of sending a newsletter. I'm going to talk about something that is important to me in the hopes that, again, maybe one person hears that and somehow thinks differently than they did before they started reading the newsletter. And I think that kind of goes back to like doing the best that you can at any given moment. When you have a place in this world and a space in this world what are you doing to make sure that when you leave it, it's better than the way you found it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Would you call that, if you had to, sort of assign that to a value, or a tenet of yours, what word would you use for that?
Stewardship.
Yeah.
Because I do think that's funny when I think of stewardship, like when I think of the people who are making the world a better place, I think of like Greta Thunberg, who's doing amazing things with her little life and making people wake up and listen. And I think about, the tireless advocates who work in election law, of the people who are the people on the front lines, who are in hospitals risking their own health to treat COVID deniers. Those are people who are moving the needle of the world in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
But I do think that you can be a steward of thought and opinion too. And in some ways, that's what I think artists are for.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. No, because art is something, and we could go off on a tangent, that we create that nobody knew they needed until it was created. Yeah. No, absolutely.
Right. And then you're like, oh my God, I didn't know I needed this, but I did.
Exactly. Those are the best, right? When they come back to you and say, thank you. And you're like, what? You're like, I was just speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. But it's like, I saw myself in that. And, it's that idea again of literature, of shows, of music being both a window and a mirror. It takes you out somewhere and also allows you to see yourself in it.
Yeah. Connection, right? I mean, it's absolute connection. In coaching, we talk about gremlins, the inner critic, right?
Yeah, I don't, because I have plenty of overt.
You don't have any. I'm so curious though, because, my whole sort of philosophy is that, some people are like, I've got to get rid of that voice in my head. Well, that voice in your head was created to protect you at some point, and it did. It was very useful at some point. But what voices in your head do you have that you'd like to recast their roles, rewrite their script?
I honestly, I think the voices in my head, that the ones I wish I could silence, are the ones that listen to the outside critics. Like for some reason you can get 100 complimentary comments, and of course what sticks out is the negative one.
Yeah.
And part of my mission recently has been trying to explain to people, when you send that tweet, when you post on someone's Facebook wall and you tag an author in a negative review, they read it. It's not going into a void. They're human. Be aware of what you're doing, and whether what you're saying is constructive or whether what you're saying is just an opinion, which is totally fine. But then don't go to the person's Facebook page to tell them that you hated their book, things like that.
Yeah.
So I think I do try to think about that. You don't want to focus and get in a weird hell loop where you're just hearing the negative voices, because that's crippling. And I think a lot of writers get debilitated by that. And, I would say in theater, it is very easy to be debilitated. You hear no a lot more than you hear yes. And unfortunately, the tastemakers are very select, and they like a certain thing. I mean, let's face it.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of ways to connect with audiences and to help audiences find joy or meaning that may not be Ben Brantley or Jesse Green's cup of tea.
Yeah.
And that's okay. You have to remember, when you read a review, it's one person's opinion.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because it sounds like what the gremlin is saying, I don't know, you tell me, is he or she saying, I told you so, or you're not good enough, or you better not, you better be careful? Is it more a cautionary?
Like, see, you were right. I mean, what you write isn't what's going to win the awards, get the nominations, and that is another entire discussion. Commercial writing is very different from literary writing. The books themselves do not have to be quite so different. It's all in how they're marketed and how they're shelved. Yeah. And it's a very arbitrary distinction. And you can have excellent commercial fiction and really terrible literary fiction. But excellent commercial fiction is not often given its due. And when you add to that the gender discrimination in publishing, that's a whole different ball of wax, where if a woman writes a book, it is considered a women's fiction.
Right.
What they really mean is the woman wrote the book. I mean, you can call my books chick lit or women's fiction. It's very bad chick lit because it's not very, funny and uplifting. But in terms of women's fiction, 50% of my fan mail comes from men. So I don't know what you want to tell them, but you know what?
Yeah.
There's this immediate default.
No, for sure. I'm so curious. Are you more upset with yourself for taking that, like, or are you more upset with the person for doing it? Like, are you more upset that someone is using their voice not for good, or are you more upset that they said it about you?
I am way more upset that they're not using their voice for good.
That's
Way more upset. There were points during the pandemic, particularly with theater critics, who were panning productions that were being done online, which, for God's sake, they kept theater alive.
Yeah.
They kept people connected to an entire medium.
Yep.
And my thought was, hi, excuse me, what are you doing to help your industry?
Yeah.
Right?
No, absolutely. No.
Yeah. And I was like, fine. You don't like what was created, by some theater company in Chicago, whatever. But you could give people just a tiny modicum of respect.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Can you finish this phrase real quick? Most people think Jodi Picoult ... But the truth is Jodi Picoult.
Oh yeah. Most people think that I am really dark and cerebral and angsty because of the things that I choose to write.
Mm.
And actually I am very bubbly, very fun. And people are always shocked when they meet me for face to face because they think that I must be, very serious and dark all the time because of the topics that I choose to address. But I'm actually not like that at all.
We do. I'm going to say what makes you, and I'm going to say a word, and you just say the first thing that comes to mind. Take your time. It's not really rapid fire, but It could be. All right. So, for instance, what makes you hungry?
Wow. I'm thinking this time clocks because I tend to fast. I don't eat before noon. So when I see the clock turn to 11:30, I'm like, I'm hungry now. Yes. Yeah. I just, honestly, what makes me hungry is fasting.
That's fair. That's fair. Yeah, no, that's
answer, but it's true.
That's amazing. All right. What makes you sad?
Right now, America.
Mm. What inspires you?
My kids. My kids inspire me. They are, like I said, they are just in their own ways. They are making the world a much better place. And sometimes I just step back with, the gaze of an observer and think, I would want to know them even if I hadn't created them.
Yeah. You know, what's cool about that, and you, in the context of you and the way you work and everything, is that kids, as we know, as mothers, you can't control.
I know. So there's a point where you look back and go, oh, all right, I did okay.
What frustrates you?
What frustrates me? What frustrates me is discrimination in the fields where I'm working really hard to climb mountains. Very often there are very real ceilings that exist because of race, because of gender. I obviously do not feel the racial element of that, but there is gender discrimination that's very strong in both publishing and in theater.
Oh, what makes you laugh?
What makes me laugh? Okay, what makes me laugh is a running standoff between my husband and one of our 3 dogs. Every morning, Alvin needs to get a pill because he has arthritis. And my husband has done everything that he can to feed him this pill. He has tried to bury the pill in, every kind of adult food you can imagine, and he can smell it. And so he eats his way around this pill and spits it out just right at his feet every single day.
Oh my God.
And the best thing is that if I do it, he'll take it. There's a running standoff with my husband, and it's so entertaining.
That's amazing. What makes you angry?
Right now, people who won't get vaccinated. That makes me very angry.
And finally, what makes you grateful?
What makes me grateful is really it's going to come down to, I think, my husband. I could not do what I do without him. He makes my life run so that I can really do everything else that I need to do. And that started at the very beginning when he was like, I was making 0 money, but he was like, you need to write, so you should write.
Mm,
Not everyone gets that kind of partner, and I'm very lucky to have that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
If you could tell 10-year-old, 8-year-old Jodi something that you know now that you didn't know then that maybe she would have really liked to have heard or would have been helpful, what would you tell her?
Oh, you can make a living doing this.
Mm.
Because I didn't know any real writers. And my mom said, that's great that you want to be a writer. Who's going to support you? So it's very good for me to know that there are people out there who can make this work. I think that's true in like any career in the arts.
Yeah. And that's very inspiring. I mean, that'll be great for people to hear, I'm not surprised that, you knew exactly what you would tell them and everybody else that wants to listen. I listened last night to the speech you gave at Princeton at your alma mater. And I loved it. First of all, Thanks. It really encompasses, if anyone wants to get to know Jodi a little bit more, everything that you sort of touched on, right? With stewardship all the way.
That was actually, I loved doing that speech. It was really an honor. And it was, I enjoyed writing it and delivering it.
What are the top 3 things that have happened so far today?
Oh, well, first of all, I got an amazing night's sleep. I went to bed at 7:00 because I did not feel well yesterday. And wow. I think I just needed to sleep. So I woke up feeling very refreshed. That was the first thing. The second thing was that I had arranged to take a hike with a neighbor of mine. And we usually walk between 6 to 8 miles together. But we decided we were going to do 10. Whoa. And part of this involves going past a construction zone with some very nasty people from the Department of Transportation who made us literally climb a cliff wall to get past a bridge construction. They were terrible people, but we did it. And the third thing was my husband texted me to say, I'm making you an Impossible Burger for lunch. I'm very excited about that.
So I probably should let you go have that burger. I so appreciate you taking the time to be in the moment with me today. Thank you.
Really fun. Thank you for having me, Lisa. This was great.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure. Go eat.
Bye.
Bye. In music, stop time is that beautiful moment where the band is suspended in rhythmic unison, supporting the soloist to express their individuality. In the moment, I encourage you to take that time and create your own rhythm. Until next time, I'm Lisa Hopkins. Thanks for listening.